Welcome to another episode of Who's Who in the Zoo. And today we're going to be talking about building certifiers. I've asked Peter Hofstetter to join me. Let me tell you about Peter. Peter has been a building certifier since 1994. He's had over 27 years experience specialising in commercial buildings. So these are buildings that include shopping centres, laboratories, hospital, aged care, educational buildings like schools, industrial, high-rise offices and residential towers. Peter is a founding director of Certis, a building certification company that began in the year 2000. Certis has offices in Brisbane and Sydney and employs 25 people. Certis specialises in the commercial market sector in building certification, disability access and energy efficiency. In 2016, Peter was instrumental in Certis launching short informational videos to the building industry discussing various aspects of the building code. He is also the inventor of a tool that quickly and accurately measures the rises and goings of stairs. He called it the Rise and Go Stair Checker, but he tells me quite emphatically he won't be appearing on Shark Tank anytime soon. Welcome, Peter, to this morning's episode of Who's Who in the Zoo.
Hey, Rob. Thank you.
Peter, just to kind of get the ball rolling, I'd ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to start in the role of certifier, and what is it that interests you in this job, and how did you get to the role that you're in today in 2022?
Okay. Well, I'm always interested in why people choose certification, because it's not the sort of job that any careers guidance officer at school is likely to talk about, and it's not one of the jobs that kids want to be when they grow up: fireman, policeman, soldier, sailor, that sort of thing, pilot. I was a carpenter at the time, and one of the guys on site said to me they're advertising for building inspectors at council, and I said, I don't want to be a building policeman. And he said, I don't think it's like that. And my wife at the time wanted me to get a job that paid, even when it's raining, paid holiday pay, sick pay, as a carpenter on hourly rate. That none of that happened, and so I joined council and discovered that it's a job that I have loved ever since. The satisfaction of having something to show what you've built as a carpenter was replaced by the satisfaction of helping people with their designs. And it's a really interesting job because you've got white collar work as a consultant and blue collar work on site. So you're in and out of the office. There's a lot of variety. And there's an endless series of variations. So I really like the job.
So Peter, tell me, what does a certifier do on a day-to-day basis? What does a typical day or a collection task look like?
Okay, I'd like to just share a screen because I'll just show you a building certifier. What is it? So technically our title is building surveyor. And in the building industry, there's three types of surveyor: the quantity surveyor, the land surveyor, and the building surveyor. And the building surveyor is focused on fire and life safety and health and amenity. Now, we're not town planners. And so building certifier is one of the roles that a building surveyor has. But it's probably, for most of us, it's the biggest role. And for the public and the legislators, building certifier is the go-to charge. So we're not town planners. Town planning is all about the big picture. How do you scope a city and have like things in different areas? Whereas a building surveyor is focused on the individual trees, specifically the buildings. And we look at, like I said, fire and life safety and health and amenity.
Okay.
We've got there's two functions. Are we a policeman or are we a judge? And often we're a little bit of both. We have an enforcement role. We have a legislative role where we are administering the law, but we're not policemen. We're called on to make judgment calls, but we're not a judge. So what we do is that we assess that on a day-to-day basis. A certifier assesses plans and issues approval. We inspect the building during construction, then issue the final certificate, occupation certificate. And if there are ambiguities in the legislation, we'll adjudicate on that.
Okay. So you've just raised an interesting issue, Peter. Sometimes I'm watching the television and the media crew is following some poor certifier as he leaves his office, and they're really having a go at the poor guy for something that he's approved.
Yeah.
What is wrong with that picture? Is he approving something particular that, I don't want to mention specific buildings, but I think most Australians are quite aware of some famous failures in the buildings themselves. What does the certifier's role have to do with that, or perhaps have not to do with that?
Well, there's this idea that I've certified it, and therefore I'm holding the can. I'm responsible for the entire thing, whereas I don't see it that way. I see myself as part of the team of people that designs it, builds it, and basically works out that it's okay. We've got a legislated role. So we're simply one of the checks and balances in the building industry. Our role used to be managed by local governments. So back in the early 90s, you had to go to council to get a building permit to build a pergola or an office tower. Councils issued that, and it was the state or the federal government that decided, does that need to be a local government monopoly? And so that's why they introduced private certification, because they felt that the building industry could benefit from a less structured approach. I think there was a real push to provide quicker service because applications and approvals were getting bogged down in council for weeks and weeks, and they thought that the private industry, as a private thing, might respond more quickly.
Okay. So, Peter, one of the questions I'd like to ask you is sort of, where do you add in your opinion, where do you add your most value to a project? You've talked about you're not a judge, but you're sometimes a judge. You're not a policeman, but you're sometimes a policeman. Where do you add your most value? I think there's some other roles in there that you haven't sort of touched on as well, but where do you add your most value?
I think it's up front. I remember early in my days, I was at a seminar and someone explained that by the time schematic design is finished, 75% of the cost of the building is already locked in.
Mm.
So they were saying that if the certifier is actually going to make any difference, they need to be involved right from the beginning. And I think that's true. And it happens rarely now, but you still occasionally get someone that comes along and says, I finally got my DA from council, I'm ready to get it certified. And then you look at it and find this doesn't comply. I can't certify this. And at worst case, they need to go back to council to modify their DA. Now, in New South Wales, they try and get around that by requiring that a building code compliance report is submitted with the town planning application. That doesn't happen in Queensland. It's not a bad idea, just to know that it is capable of being approved. So yeah, best value is in problem solving and being upfront.
What does a good day in the office look like, Pete?
Well, Paul Simon in one of his songs said, "A good day has no rain, and a bad day is when I sit and think about what might have been." But for me, a good day is when all the questions I get asked by clients and staff are questions that I can answer. That I can help them solve their problem just like that. And they think I'm really good, and I go home feeling great because I was able to help all these people, and they just all the stuff that I've learned over the years just comes out nice and easy, and it solves their problems.
Hmm.
So obviously,
you've moved the needle. So I guess by juxtaposition, a bad day at the office is when none of those things happen. But is there another definition for a bad day at the office?
Yeah, well, all the questions are hard. All the questions are really ambiguous and need, or when you're training new staff and they're reading the legislation different from you, and they go, but hang on, what about this? And they give you a different way of looking at it that sounds right, but then challenge you to think, well, if that's right, then I've been doing it wrong for 20 years. Or worse than that, someone rings up and said, we've just taken over this job at number 1 Smith. We now own this building at Smith Street, and you people approved it 10 years ago, and we've been told that this, and this are all wrong. So you've got to dig through the archive to find out, A, is it wrong? B, were we complicit in that?
whatever that was. Yeah,
That's a huge time-consuming bad day.
yeah. Now, Peter, there's been an extraordinary amount of change in the National Construction Code.
Yeah.
I think from memory, I read that something like more than 2,000 changes have occurred since the 2016 to the 2019 versions of the construction code. So that's a lot of construction changes to stay across.
Yeah.
How do you do it? How do you expect other designers and stakeholders to do it? What are some of the challenges that you find around changing codes, variations in code?
Well, yeah, the biggest challenge is keeping up with it. And I think that's keeping up with the constant change in legislation and the building code. Standards get revised. Staying on top of it is not easy. And often, for instance, changes in standards, I learned that from people like you, from the specialists that ring up and say, look, we've got AS whatever 2020 has now been adopted by the BCA. And it says, and they drill down into some very specific stuff. What I forgot to tell you was that as a certifier, we know a little bit about a lot of things, a lot about the building code, but we're a very generalist sort of thing. And I like to say that a certifier is to construction as a GP is to medicine. It's the specialists in the building industry are all the engineering services, engineering consultants. So from them, I learn about changes in various standards, but I've got to read all the changes in the BCA. And I go, the building code does an annual roadshow where they talk about highlights. I consider that mandatory for all certifiers to go, all our staff. So that's our number one document is the BCA.
So, Peter, I'm presuming you're across the sort of changes that we're seeing in particularly New South Wales and Sydney. And this is a sort of a change where perhaps it's more structured now, but they're looking to see that engineers in particular have this role and training as a certifier, not as a principal certifier, but having this sort of certification aspect to their job.
Yes.
In terms of the changes that are happening in New South Wales, do you feel that these are good changes, or are they like to be generally applied everywhere, or do you think that they're changes that are specific to New South Wales because they don't have a system like the Queensland RPEQ and Victorian system? What's your view on this sort of some of this anointing of other trades to become
They are fantastic changes, Rob. They are 2 decades overdue.
Right. Okay, that's good. They do require a week of time to train for this. But,
I started my certification career in Queensland, and Queensland had the Building Services Authority, now called the QBCC, and basically everyone had a license. All the people working on buildings had a license. All the engineers had an RPEQ license. When I started working in New South Wales, I discovered that I was one of me and electricians and some fire engineers were about the only ones that were required to have a license. So the engineers that signed off on some of the structural failure buildings, they weren't required to be licensed at the time. So, you've got to think, well, how is the certifier able to sign off on a building? They get a certificate from an engineer, but there's no requirement for them to be licensed. So you can look them up and say, well, they seem to be an engineer, but checking license requirements in Queensland is a lot easier because there's only a few places you have to go to. To go to the National Engineering Register, someone could be a member of, or the Fire Protection Association. They can be members of these organisations, but they can choose not to have their details on the website. So I can get a certificate from a John Smith mechanical engineer. I can go to the National Engineering Register and find that, he's not there. You look at their website and it says John Smith's been an engineer for 25 years and he's great. Yeah, how do I prove it? You've got a nice looking website, but as a certifier, how am I supposed to have confidence?
So this New South Wales system where we might all have little c certification roles, minor certification roles, you're seeing that as a good thing and potentially a well overdue capacity.
So, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Peter, one of the things... Sorry?
I was going to say, in Queensland, the legislation goes a step further, which I think is really good, and that is that In Queensland, if a person is appropriately licensed as a certifier, I'm allowed to accept their certificate and rely on it. It's enshrined in the legislation. So I say to my staff, we need to do enough inspections to be confident that the certificates we're given at the end of the job are worth the paper they're printed on.
Okay. So, Peter, one of the things that I'm curious about is, Australia is a country that has access to technologies from overseas. A lot of these technologies are, innovative products by our standards, and yet they may not suit or fit neatly into our category of an appropriate or credentialed product. And it's not just necessarily the product, it might even be the technique. For example, in Europe, merging a solid fuel kitchen exhaust and a normal kitchen exhaust is passé, happens all day, every day. But in Australia, it is invoking, the wrath of the gods. So I guess I'm just saying that there's this kind of juxtaposition of what happens overseas and what can happen overseas versus what happens in Australia. At the same time, there's this environment where there is a lot of change, our appreciation of the environment, and not just the, if you like, the climate, but also the environment that we work in and live in. All of these environments are changing and they're quite volatile. To what extent do you find yourself kind of adjudicating on people's expectations in the modern world versus the Building Code of Australia and where those various standards sit? Do you ever find yourself, I guess, wishing to advocate for more performance solutions? It's kind of behind this question. Where do performance solutions sit within the arsenal of tactics for a design team? And are they things that, you generally encourage, discourage, or you have sort of no particularly strong view on?
No, I think performance solutions are great. The objective of a performance solution is to demonstrate that what's proposed is as good or better than the deemed to satisfy solution. So the deemed to satisfy represents a line drawn in the sand, albeit historically acceptable. So who said that 20 metres to a point of choice is the right travel distance? Who said that X litres per minute is the correct extraction rate for exhaust? Well, over the years, those standards get modified and changed, and as people learn more, for instance, talking mechanical, car park exhaust in an apartment building, there's only 2 times in a day when there's a lot of CO2 generated, and that's when people go to work and when they come home. And so having the fan controls modified, it used to be that those fans had to run all day, whereas the standards change, and that's part of performance.
Okay, excellent. Do you see any environments or potential circumstances where performance solutions may not be executed for the reasons intended? Are there any times that we see people use performance solutions in a way that perhaps isn't in the project's best interest?
Well, sometimes there's attempts. I remember being asked by a developer, if I did this, do you think I could do this with a performance solution? I said, yeah. And then he said, well, what about if I did this? And I said, if you were to try that, I think you'd be putting my PI insurance in jeopardy. He said, no, Peter, I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to find out where the boundary is. So in terms of what the intention of performance solutions was, I worked for council back in the early 90s, and that's when the building code changed to be a performance document. And the building codes board did a roadshow to explain what the benefits of performance are. So a performance clause simply says how a building is meant to perform. The deemed to satisfy says, in order to perform that way, you must do X, Y, and Z. But you don't have to. You could just say, well, if we do A, B, and C, it will be as good or better than X, Y, and Z, and it'll satisfy the performance solution. So the reasons for a performance document, one is to allow for new products to be taken up and used quicker than getting the legislation changed. So if you were to develop a different mechanical exhaust system that didn't comply with the current standard, you could wait years trying to get on the standards committee to get the standard changed and get it adopted. Or you could demonstrate by performance that it's actually going to work. So that's one. Speed of getting to the market, allowing for design and architects to design innovative buildings that don't necessarily fit the rectangular plumb level and square world that the standards would apply. 3 is to save money. If there's a waste, there's an inherent potential waste. And for example, the fire resistance levels for all the structural elements are the same whether the building is sprinkled or not sprinkled. Surely there's less likely of collapse if the building is sprinkler protected. But there's a whole lot of things like that. And I kind of thought when performance came in, after a few years, we started seeing the same issues being done by performance on building after building. And I expected that the deemed to satisfy would change as a result. That didn't happen. I think that it could have happened if the government had said all performance solutions need to get lodged in a central repository. They could have been sifting through that, saying, "Oh, look at this. This is the same thing over and over again. This appears to be safe." That could be changed into the deemed to satisfy.
Okay.
And then so saving money can be at the design stage or it can be during the construction stage. So that's during the construction phase is where there is a big divide in terms of what people's perception is. Something changes during construction, and if you do a performance solution to say, yes, that's okay, then some people think, whoa, that's just the certifier trying to help the builder out. And so there's this perception that there's a perception in some people that a performance solution should only be done at the design stage.
It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because sometimes things happen on site and they're very hard to undo. I'm thinking of a builder building a riser that's accidentally too small.
Yep.
And now there's a real challenge on how, in this instance, the ventilation would work. So I can appreciate that sometimes we need performance solutions that may originate during the construction process.
Yes.
Peter, how has your job become more difficult with the rise of design and construct methodology?
It's become more difficult because buildings have become more complicated. When I started, for instance, all apartment buildings were concrete slab and block walls between apartments. Now there's all sorts of systems of fire-rated plasterboard, Hebel, lightweight construction. There's a whole lot of different systems, and all of them have to get penetrated by services, and then all of those penetrations need to be protected to prevent fire from jumping from one compartment to another. And there are a myriad of details. So we now have a new suite of services being provided by passive fire installers, which didn't used to happen.
It's like a whole new trade has sort of popped up.
It's a specialist field. There is so much variety that it's a specialist field. Although some people expect me to know every system, but I don't.
Peter, one of the purposes of this podcast is to really get into empathy. So the listeners will have their role in the design or construction process, and we're trying to, I guess, allow everyone to develop a sense of empathy. In terms of having empathy towards certifiers, what are some of the kind of crucial conversations or crucial tasks that stakeholders in the design process or the construction process need to have? What are the key things we need to talk about with you?
Okay, I'd like to say that the biggest one would be don't keep us in the dark, hoping that we might notice. So it's better that the conversations happen early.
No mind reading. I hear what you're saying there. No mind reading.
We're all on the same side, and that is the side of good building practice. So we're not the enemy. We're not the policeman. So ask questions. And then if you are a specialist engineer and you've got a question, give us all the information that we need in order to help you work out what seems reasonable. Don't just send an email and say, what's your view on clause 3.5.7 of AS 1234? I used to think I was supposed to know this stuff, and I spend hours reading this standard, trying to work out, what does that clause mean and what's the intention of it. Eventually I got wise and thought, hang on, I think this person is a specialist. This is their standard. They should be telling me why it doesn't comply.
Yeah. Yeah. So to summarize the comments so far is to give you an informed comment and an informed question, so that you're able to really participate with that question. In other words, should this happen in methodology A or should this happen in methodology B? Would be. Are there any other tough and difficult questions? Crucial conversations.
From the design consultants, just understand that we have to interrogate your certificates, and that if we can't find out whether you're licensed or not, please don't take it as an insult. But that's what the legislation says we've got to do. How Mr. Hofstetter, how on earth did you rely on this certificate from Robert Lord? What are his qualifications? Well, I've known him for a while. He's a good bloke. No. He is an RPEQ. Here's an whatever. And so that's one thing. So when we get certificates from a company and it's signed by a person who's not a director and not one of the nominees, we've got to send it back and say, well, John Smith doesn't appear to be any of these people.
Yeah.
Understand that we're not the clerk of works. Our role is, we're not the quality control officer for a project. We are one of the checks and balances. We have an audit role.
Okay. Yep.
And we're human.
Well, I don't think too many people will forget that, but it is important, I think, that they approach this role with respect. Is really where you're coming from, I suspect. So that's good. Peter, with the future, so we're talking about post 2022. In the future, what do you think are going to be ever-increasing difficulties for the certification role?
Well, the first one's going to happen in September this year. Is the building code is coming out as BCA 2022, and for Volume 1, they're changing the numbering system.
Right.
We had a simple, elegant numbering system before, and now they're going to complicate.
Muck it around a bit. Right.
So, and suddenly I'm looking at this draft, and I tried to put in my submission, please don't do this. Please don't do this.
What was the purpose for the renumbering? Is there just so much change they've had to expand?
No, I didn't think it was necessary, but if you've ever had to reference clauses in Volume 2 of the BCA, it's clause 3.1.2.4.5b, and whereas in the BCA it was clause D1.2c, and occasionally C1. Just simple. Now they're going to make it D1 D1C10 2. There's a two-part to the main number before you have to get to the subclause. And they have said, well, we will be including the original number in there, so you can still search the document for the original number. Okay. But if ever there was a situation where this old dog can't learn a new trick, I think I'm staring down the barrel of one.
Yeah, certainly changing numbers is always difficult because we get so used to cross-referencing. And lots of us will have template reports which rely on, a list of stated clauses and conditions. So we have to be much more on our game about what we're doing there. What other changes, Peter? I mean, at the risk of sounding rude, if simply changing the numbers on NCC was your biggest issue, I think there'd be some other things that'd be more pressing or just as challenging.
The changing perception of the certifier's role by the legislators. So when private certification came in, we were told that we're now going to be in private business. We're going to be a consultant. We're going to be providing a customer service. We're a client-facing role. The narrative has shifted over the last 10 years as the legislators have sort of have worried that we are corruptible, if not already corrupted. And therefore, what they're saying is, no, you're standing in the shoes of government. No, you're not a customer-focused person. You're a building code compliance officer. You have a regulatory role, and you're meant to be this particular type of hard nut, yes, no, it complies or it doesn't comply. Some jurisdictions consider that giving advice is a conflict of interest if you're also approving the job. So New South Wales legislation has a dual role. If you want to give building code compliance advice, then you're engaged by the developer as a consultant, and someone else is doing the building certification or approval role. The irony is that if you're giving advice and the other person disagrees with it, their view wins. So if you're a very regulatory-minded person issuing your building approval who doesn't like performance solutions, for instance, or is not comfortable with the performance solution that the BCA consultant is suggesting would be a way out, that's it, game over. You're stuck with the other person's view. Whereas in Queensland, you can give the advice and you can issue the approval. You can be part of the solution.
I mean, I must admit, Peter, there's a bit of challenge here. Like, for example, I'd feel a bit disconcerted if I was in a court of law and suddenly the judge started giving advice to the opposing side, for example. Judges don't normally give advice. So when you speak about the certifier being part judge and part policeman, I think there are places where giving advice may be difficult. But I think in this role, you're more going to be in that sort of space of assisting the design team reach a state of compliance that would be acceptable under peer review. How much peer review goes on with certifiers?
Well, internally, we have a review. We have one person do an assessment and then another person does the second check or peer review, so that we're less likely to send out reports that have mistakes in them. Obviously, both people are human, so it's not foolproof, but it's part of our QA process.
Yeah, so that's within Certis.
Yes.
Does it ever occur that some body would, like some formal body, would say, let's have a look at a few certifications by Peter Hofstetter and just review whether we would share that view? Does that sort of over the shoulder review ever occur?
Well, from a government point of view, that's happening in New South Wales at the moment with apartment buildings, where the building commissioner is doing audits of buildings before the final certificate is issued, and really trying to clean up the perception of the building industry and protect the unit owners that have become exposed to a broken system. Part of the system was broken because none of them were licensed. So if they had to get a license and they had to have insurance, then the standards, I expect, would have been higher. So at the moment, the commissioner is auditing those sort of things. So we are having our shoulder looked over in that respect. Internally, in a building process, if it's a very complicated fire engineering issue, then often you'll get another fire engineer to do a peer review as part of the process.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time today, Peter. I am honoured that you've given me the time that you have. I think we've covered probably the big points about what sort of a role a certifier plays, and also just given us a snapshot of some of the challenges that you face in the office on a day-to-day basis. So thanks again for your time, and I hope to see you around on the traps.
All right. Thanks, Rob.
All the best, Peter. Bye-bye.